Welcome to Bedtime Whisper. Now get comfortable, take a slow breath, and let's begin tonight's journey. The sea was quiet that evening, not silent, because the sea is never truly silent, but quiet in the way an old friend becomes quiet after telling a long story. The waves rolled against the rocks below the lighthouse with a slow rhythm, like a giant breathing peacefully in sleep. High above those waves stood a white lighthouse on a lonely stretch of coastline where very few people lived. Its lantern shone softly across the darkening water, and inside lived a man named Thomas. Thomas was 73 years old. His hair had become the color of winter clouds, and his hands carried the gentle marks of a lifetime spent outdoors. He had lived at the lighthouse for nearly 40 years, long enough to know every path through the cliffs, long enough to recognize the cries of individual seabirds, long enough to notice changes in the weather before the clouds themselves seemed aware of them. But there was something unusual about Thomas. Every evening, no matter what happened, he sat at a small wooden desk beside his window and wrote about the rain. Not the amount of rain, not the temperature, not scientific measurements. Instead, he wrote about how the rain sounded. His journals filled entire shelves, hundreds of notebooks, thousands of pages, each one describing a different rainfall. To anyone else, this might have seemed strange, but to Thomas, every rainstorm was unique. And over the years, listening to rain became something much deeper than a hobby. It became a way of understanding the world and understanding himself. Tonight was no different. As dusk settled across the sea, he lit a small lamp and opened a fresh notebook. The rain had started only minutes before. Tiny drops tapped softly against the lighthouse windows. Thomas listened carefully. Then he smiled. He dipped his pen into ink and began writing. Tonight's rain sounds like distant footsteps returning home. He paused. The sound shifted slightly. A gentle breeze moved across the cliffside. The drops changed their rhythm. Now it sounds like pages turning in a quiet library. He nodded to himself. Perfect. Outside, the world continued slowing down. The fishing boats had already returned to harbor. The gulls were settling onto rocky ledges. The horizon had become a soft blend of silver and blue. Everything seemed to be preparing for sleep. Everything except the rain. The rain continued its endless conversation with the earth, and Thomas continued listening. Many years earlier, when Thomas first arrived at the lighthouse, he had been a very different man. He was 33 then, restless, always thinking, always planning, always worried about something. He worried about tomorrow. He worried about next year. He worried about things that had happened 10 years ago. His mind rarely rested, even at night, especially at night. Back then, sleep did not come easily. His thoughts moved faster than the wind, faster than the tides, faster than anything he could control. One autumn evening during his first year at the Lighthouse, a storm arrived, a tremendous storm, the kind that filled the sky with dark clouds from horizon to horizon. Rain hammered the windows, waves crashed against the cliffs. The entire lighthouse seemed wrapped in the voice of the storm. Thomas sat awake for hours, unable to sleep. His mind was crowded with worries. But eventually something unexpected happened. He became tired of listening to his own thoughts. So instead he listened to the rain, really listened, for the first time. Not as background noise, not as weather, as sound, as music, as something alive. The rain struck different surfaces in different ways. The roof produced a soft drumming rhythm. The windows created a delicate tapping. The stone walls seemed to hum quietly beneath it all. There were layers within layers, patterns within patterns. The storm became less like chaos and more like a symphony. Somewhere during that long night, Thomas stopped thinking about his worries. Not because they disappeared, but because his attention had moved elsewhere, toward something gentler, something present, something real. By morning, he felt strangely peaceful. It was the best sleep he had experienced in years. The next time it rained, he listened again, and again, and again. Eventually, he started writing notes, simple observations, a few sentences, nothing important, or so he thought. Years passed. The notes became journals. The journals became a collection. The collection became a lifelong ritual. And slowly, almost without noticing, Thomas changed. His worries became lighter. His thoughts became quieter. His days became slower. Not empty. Not boring. Simply slower. Like the sea. Like the tides. Like rain itself. On another evening, many years later, a young traveler arrived at the lighthouse. Her name was Eleanor. She had been hiking along the coastline and lost track of time. Night approached faster than expected. Thomas invited her inside. They shared warm tea beside the window while rain drifted gently across the glass. Eleanor noticed the shelves, hundreds of notebooks, more notebooks than she had ever seen in one place. "What are those?" she asked. Thomas smiled. "My rain journals," she laughed softly. "Rain journals? Yes. You've written about rain?" "For nearly 40 years. Eleanor stared at him. Surely he was joking, but his expression remained calm. Curious, she picked up one of the notebooks. Inside, she found page after page of descriptions. Rain that sounds like distant sheep bells. Rain that whispers through sleeping grass. Rain that arrives shyly and leaves quietly. Rain that dances across the roof like tiny shoes. The entries continued for years, decades, thousands upon thousands of observations. Eleanor finally looked up. Why? Thomas considered the question. Outside, rain continued falling softly. At last he answered, because every rainstorm is different. She smiled politely, but Thomas could see she didn't fully understand. Most people didn't. So he pointed toward the window. Listen. She listened. At first she heard only rain. The same thing everyone hears. Rain. Nothing more. But Thomas waited patiently. After a minute, he asked again, "What do you hear?" She frowned slightly. The rain. Listen beneath the rain. So she listened longer. Slowly, details began appearing. The sound on the roof, the sound on the glass, the distant sound of water running through grass, the faint rhythm of drops landing on stone. Different sounds, different textures, different voices. The rain was not one sound, it was many. Eleanor's expression changed. For the first time, she heard it. Not weather. Music. Thomas smiled. Most people rush past things. She nodded. We rush past sunsets. We rush through meals. We rush through conversations. The rain continued speaking against the windows. And when we rush, Thomas said, we miss how much beauty exists in ordinary moments. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They simply listened. The sea below, the wind outside, the rain on the lighthouse, the warmth of the room, the ticking of an old clock, the comfort of being nowhere else. That night, after Eleanor had gone to sleep in the guest room, Thomas remained beside the window. The rain had become lighter now, almost a mist. The lighthouse lantern rotated slowly above him. Its beams swept across the dark sea, again and again and again. The familiar rhythm felt comforting, predictable, steady. Thomas opened another journal. He wrote carefully. Tonight, a traveler learned that rain contains many voices. He paused, then added, perhaps peace begins when we stop searching for extraordinary things and start noticing ordinary ones. The words felt true. Outside, the rain drifted across the sleeping coastline. The waves continued their endless journey toward shore. Far away, a fishing boat moved slowly through darkness, guided by the lighthouse beam. And high above the sea, in a small room filled with journals, Thomas listened. Not because he needed answers, not because he wanted anything, simply because listening itself had become enough. And as the night deepened, the rain continued telling its ancient stories, stories without beginnings, stories without endings, stories that asked nothing from anyone except attention, and in return offered something rare, stillness. The night moved quietly across the coastline. Hours passed almost unnoticed. The rain softened until it became little more than a silver mist floating through the darkness. Thomas remained by the window. He was never in a hurry to sleep, not because he struggled with rest anymore. Quite the opposite. Sleep had become a trusted companion over the years, something that arrived naturally when welcomed, not chased. So he sat comfortably in his wooden chair and watched the lighthouse beam sweep across the sea. Far below, waves rolled onto the rocks. Each wave seemed slightly different. Some arrived gently, others with more confidence, yet together they formed a rhythm that had existed long before Thomas was born. A rhythm that would continue long after he was gone. He found comfort in that thought. There was something peaceful about belonging to a world that did not depend on constant effort. The sea knew how to move. The clouds knew how to drift. The rain knew how to fall. And perhaps, Thomas often thought, people also knew how to rest. Sometimes they simply forgot. The following morning arrived quietly. The storm had completely disappeared. Sunlight spread across the water like liquid gold. The air smelled fresh and clean. Eleanor awoke early. She stepped outside the lighthouse and stood on the cliffs overlooking the sea. Everything felt different. Not because the landscape had changed, but because she had. The previous evening had been the first time in months she had spent an entire hour doing nothing except listening. No phone, no schedule, no destination, just listening. She had forgotten how calming that could be. Thomas soon joined her, carrying 2 mugs of tea. They sat together on a weathered wooden bench overlooking the ocean. For a while, neither spoke. They watched sunlight dance across the waves. Finally, Eleanor asked a question. "Do you ever get lonely here?" Thomas smiled. It was a question visitors often asked. He considered his answer carefully. Then he shook his head. "Not very often." "Really? Really?" Eleanor looked surprised. The nearest village was many miles away. The lighthouse stood alone against the sea. Most people imagined loneliness in such places. Thomas looked toward the horizon. "You know," he said gently, "there's a difference between being alone and feeling alone." Eleanor thought about that. Thomas continued. "When I was younger, I lived in busy cities. I was surrounded by people every day." He paused. "Yet I often felt lonely." The sea breeze moved softly through the grass. "But here," he said, looking toward the ocean, "I spend time with the rain, the sea, the birds, the changing sky." He smiled. "And sometimes travelers." Eleanor laughed. "I suppose that counts." "It does." They sat quietly again. The waves continued their patient journey toward shore. A pair of seabirds glided effortlessly above the cliffs. Somewhere in the distance, a fishing boat moved slowly through the morning light. Nothing dramatic happened, nothing exciting, and somehow that made the moment perfect. After breakfast, Thomas showed Eleanor the oldest journal in his collection. The cover had faded from years of use. Its pages had become soft and worn. Carefully, he opened it. The first entry was dated nearly 40 years earlier. Eleanor leaned closer. The handwriting looked younger, less steady, more hurried. Thomas laughed softly when he saw it. I wrote much faster back then. The first entry read, "Storm tonight. Couldn't sleep. Rain sounds louder than my thoughts." Eleanor smiled. That was all. One sentence. Nothing more. Yet it marked the beginning of everything. Thomas turned another page, then another. The entries slowly grew longer, more detailed, more thoughtful. As the years passed, something became obvious. The journals weren't only about rain. They were also about Thomas, about how he changed, about what he learned, about how his attention slowly shifted from worry toward wonder. One entry described a spring shower arriving over wildflowers. Another described rain drifting through sea fog. Another simply read, "Today the rain arrived gently." I decided to do the same. Eleanor stared at that sentence. Something about it felt important. Simple, yet important, Thomas noticed. "That's one of my favorites." She nodded. "It's beautiful." Thomas looked toward the window. "The weather teaches more than people realize." "How so?" "The rain never argues with gravity." Eleanor laughed softly. "I suppose not. The tide never worries about tomorrow's tide." "And the clouds?" Thomas smiled. "The clouds never apologize for changing shape." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Eleanor quietly said, "Humans make everything more complicated." Thomas nodded. "Sometimes." The day passed peacefully. Eleanor helped Thomas polish brass fixtures inside the lighthouse. They shared stories, prepared lunch, watched seals resting on distant rocks. As afternoon slowly drifted toward evening, clouds began gathering once again above the sea. Thomas noticed immediately. Rain was coming. Not a storm, just a gentle evening rainfall, the kind he loved most. As twilight approached, they returned to the lighthouse lantern room, the highest point in the building. Windows surrounded them on all sides. The view stretched endlessly across the ocean. The first raindrops arrived, tiny and delicate, barely audible. Thomas closed his eyes, listening. The years seemed to disappear from his face. He looked exactly like someone greeting an old friend. The rain gradually increased, soft tapping against glass, a faint rhythm on the roof, the whisper of water moving through distant grass. Eleanor listened too. This time she heard more than before, far more. The rain felt layered, complex, alive. She realized something. The sounds had always been there. She simply hadn't noticed. Most of her life had been spent rushing toward the next thing, the next task, the next goal, the next destination. Meanwhile, thousands of quiet moments had passed unnoticed, moments exactly like this one. The realization felt strangely comforting, not sad, comforting, because those moments were still available, always available, waiting patiently like the rain. As darkness settled over the sea, Thomas opened a fresh notebook. He wrote slowly, carefully, the way he always did. Eleanor watched. "What are you writing tonight?" Thomas smiled. "Today's rain sounds like a conversation between old friends." She looked out the window. The description felt perfect. The rain wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It simply moved steadily through the evening, comfortable, unhurried, certain of its place in the world, much like Thomas himself. For a long time they listened together. The lighthouse beam continued its slow rotation. The ocean breathed below. The rain spoke softly against the glass. Nothing demanded attention. Nothing required solving. Nothing needed fixing. The world simply existed, and that was enough. Later that night, Eleanor prepared to leave the next morning. Her journey would continue along the coastline. New towns, new roads, new adventures. Yet she already knew she would remember this place, not because something extraordinary had happened, because something ordinary had finally been noticed. Before going to bed, she visited Thomas one last time. He sat at his familiar desk, writing, listening, the same as always. "Thank you," she said. Thomas looked up. "For what?" She thought for a moment, then smiled. "For teaching me how to listen." Thomas returned the smile. "You're welcome." Outside, rain drifted gently across the sea. The lighthouse lantern shone into darkness, and somewhere far beyond the horizon, countless other rainstorms were falling across forests, across mountains, across villages, across sleeping cities, each one carrying its own rhythm, its own story, its own voice. Years later, travelers would still visit the lighthouse. Some came seeking views. Some came seeking photographs. Some came seeking adventure. But many left with something unexpected. A slower heartbeat, a quieter mind, a renewed appreciation for ordinary things. And on a shelf inside the lighthouse, Thomas's collection of journals continued to grow. Thousands of observations, thousands of evenings, thousands of moments of attention. A lifetime recorded not through major events, but through gentle noticing. Because Thomas had discovered something many people spend their entire lives searching for. Peace was not hidden in distant places. It was not waiting at the end of a goal. It was not reserved for special occasions. It lived quietly inside ordinary moments, inside the sound of rain against a window, inside the movement of waves beneath moonlight, inside the warmth of a lamp on a dark evening, inside a slow breath, inside stillness. And so, as another night settled over the lighthouse, Thomas wrote one final entry before sleep. He listened to the rain. He listened to the sea. He listened to the silence between sounds. Then he smiled and wrote, "Tonight, the rain sounds exactly as it should." He closed the journal, extinguished the lamp, and climbed the narrow staircase toward his room. Outside, Outside, the lighthouse beam continued its patient sweep across the ocean. The rain continued falling. The waves continued rolling toward shore. The stars remained hidden behind clouds, yet they were there all the same, waiting just beyond sight. The world carried on in its quiet rhythm, steady, gentle, unhurried, a reminder that not everything needs to be rushed, not everything needs to be solved. Sometimes it is enough to simply listen and rest